I think we are ready to go, so let's slowly start. So, dear guests, dear viewers, let me welcome you at the 5th European Values Talk. This time we'll be talking about a new book, which is called Hidden Hand, Exposing the Chinese Communist Party Hostile Interference Against Western Democracies. That's the name of our talk. And we'll talk about a new book, which is called The Hidden Hand. So this event is co-hosted by the European Values Center for Security Policy and the Macdonald Laurier Institute. So thanks for all of us who made this possible. And we will actually be speaking with 3 distinguished experts and myself as a moderator. So I'm Jakub Janda, I'm Director of European Values Center for Security Policy. But we will have 3 experts talking about the topic. First will be Mareike Olberg. She is a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, now sitting in Berlin. So Mareike, good to have you with us. And the second speaker will be Clive Hamilton, who is a professor of public ethics at the 찰스스터트 University in Australia, in Canberra. So Clive, great to have you here as well. Mareike and Clive actually wrote the book, which we will be talking about, and we will ask a good friend, Charles Barton, to comment on that. Charles is a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute in Canada, and he's also a senior non-resident fellow with us with European Values Center for Security Policy in the Czech Republic. So, Charles, thank you for being with us as well. And before I give the floor to Mareike to kick it off, I was also asked by the publisher of the upcoming book, Optimum Publishing International, that the book will be out in Canada on June 16 and Australia in early July as well. So I guess that's an important thing to listen to because there'll be actually a lot of things which we will dig in today. So the very last point to make is that if some of our viewers would have a question to our speakers, please go ahead to our YouTube channel, and just below the clip, just below the video, there is a link to Slido, which is an application where you could pose easy questions, and I will get them and I'll ask our speakers here in a few minutes. So this is an on-record public panel, so everything is public and quotable, let's say. So Mareike, please, could you start it off and tell us what the new book is really about?
Thank you, Jakub, for the introduction. First off, I live in Berlin. Our internet may be bad, so I hope I don't disappear at some point. If I do, don't give up on me. I'll be back. So I want to just start the discussion off with 3 points. One about why we wrote this book, 2, what our main point is in the book, what's our main argument, and the third one is what does China, quote unquote, actually want from us and in the world. And for me, and Clive can give his own take on why he wrote the book, but for me, the essential logic for why I wanted to write this book with Clive was I wanted to get better China policy in Europe. Right now we have a situation where there's a fairly sustained, fairly well-planned, not entirely perfect, but well-organized attempt to basically divide and conquer countries in Europe, different alliances that exist with our transatlantic partners. And this fairly well-structured attempt, which some of that's covert and is going on behind the scenes, but a lot of that is actually overt and is talked about quite openly in Chinese documents, meets in Europe and also in parts of other parts of the world. What a British colleague who shall remain unnamed right now has called useful ignorance, which I find a quite useful term. It's like this absolute naivete, which sometimes people may also profit off of that naivete. But the idea is well-organized attempt meets relatively little information, and that needs to change. So at the bottom of it, this is about getting better China policy in Europe and also across the Atlantic. Now, the change that I want to affect is not so much, I think we often talk about how can we change China? Can we change China through engagement? I think part of our point here is maybe we can't change, maybe we can, but if we can change China, it's not going to be through this unconditional engagement that we have done. Instead, what we need to do is really make sure that we protect our own institutions, our own countries, our own organizations a little bit better against these attempts to basically export Chinese standards of censorship, of ways of doing things. So this is the motivation behind the book, at least for me. Now, what is the book about? It's basically a detailed expose of the influence network that the Chinese Communist Party has built in Europe, mainly in Western Europe and in North America. Now, obviously, CCP influence is a worldwide phenomenon. This is obviously not linked to Western countries, but the way that I see it is often talked about as, oh, China's influence is so big in the developing world, they're all in China's pocket. Or in Europe, the focus will often be on Central and Eastern European countries or on the 17+1 framework. And those are all issues that need to be talked about. But what is less often talked about is the CCP influence in large Western European nations, in the United States, in Canada. And this is basically what we're talking about. The network that has been built up through mainly elite entanglement in various sectors, in politics and business and academia, in the think tank world, in media and the cultural sector, at the national level, at the subnational level, at the party level, et cetera, et cetera. Now, our book is mainly pre-COVID. I think we snuck a brief anecdote on COVID-19 in there right before it went to press, but it's mainly pre-COVID. So some of this will need to be revised, and I'm happy actually to talk about how this is played out during the era of COVID-19. But basically, what we've seen is a lot of the mechanisms that we describe have actually been shown to us in the last couple of weeks in terms of the CCP contacting local governments, contacting individual bureaucracies, asking for governments to praise the Chinese response. Now, our assessment is the Chinese government may have overdone it a little bit by picking fights with too many actors at the same time. So to some extent, the sharp edge of Chinese power, the CCP's power, has been showing. On the other hand, this is not a finished story. We're kind of in unprecedented territory, and it remains to be seen how this will actually pan out. And we know in a couple of countries like Italy and Serbia, it's actually been quite successful. So this is the time to be paying attention. And last but not least, what does China want? And as you've heard already, I'm speaking not about China, but about the Chinese Communist Party, which is the main actor here. The CCP has been viewing itself as locked in a struggle against hostile forces since basically the end of the Cold War. The CCP often comes out and says, oh, the West has such a horrible Cold War mentality. That's a very common talking point, which is quite ironic coming from a government that's basically had this Cold War mindset in its thinking for the past 30 years. Now, that's gotten progressively worse under Xi Jinping. So it's not like there is no change at all, but there's been a fairly consistent message that we're locked in the struggle against hostile forces. We are encircled, and we need to change our position in order to be able to secure long-term survival of the CCP in China. We need to basically go global and make sure we don't get attacked from the outside. So on the one hand, this involves going against the main opponent, which on a global scale is kind of defined in each subsystem globally differently. But on the global scale, the main opponent would be the United States, which basically needs to be isolated from its allies. So that means weakening, breaking up alliances that exist, including the transatlantic alliance. This is an important part. This is done through various ways by establishing itself in international organizations, but also by offering alternative framework, which the most relevant for Europe is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is kind of this alternative informal alliance system, which is presented as this is purely economic, this is all win-win. This is not in competition with existing alliances, but the new alliance does come at the cost of the old alliance. And then the other idea, the main other thing that the CCP is very keen on increasing is its own, what it calls its own discourse power, 话语权, which is basically about a couple of things. One is it needs to be globally more accepted that autocracies are good. Like the system that China has is best for China. It may be good for another whole range of countries as well. It outperforms democracy. This is one aspect. The other is China is a reliable partner. China wants multilateralism. China is good for the world, whereas the United States is a global rogue that needs to be isolated from its partners. And the third one is just more general, that the CCP wants to be the most authoritative source of information, not just in China, but globally. So that, for instance, when it says the virus that we're currently dealing with did not originate in China, an overwhelming majority of people will automatically believe that this is credible information and will will think, okay, this is true because this authoritative source says it. So increasing the CCP's overall discourse power. I'm going to stop at that because I think I am almost over my time, but I'm happy to discuss more later in this round.
Okay, well, thanks, Morika. I'll carry on, if I may, directly. The story that, or the outline, I guess, that Morika started to tell about the principal themes of our book. And obviously, it's incidentally, the German edition came out on Monday, last Monday, and is doing very well. So German speakers can pick it up straight away. So one of the, perhaps the principal theme of our book is to explain with a great deal of detailed examples drawn from North America and Western Europe, to explain just how the Chinese Communist Party extends its influence into those democracies, how it extends its power. And we argue that the primary way that it goes about it is by winning over the elites in Western countries and turning them into friends of China. And once you start getting into this business in some kind of detail, whenever a CCP official or newspaper uses the word friend or friendship, or if you see it in the name of an organisation, an alarm bell immediately goes off, because foreign friends in the CCP way of thinking are those who essentially agreed, wittingly or otherwise, to promote China's, that is the CCP's, interests. So the notion of friendship is very, very important in the CCP way of thinking, its way of influencing, in the lexicon of the party. And it's a means of neutralising opponents psychologically by winning over those who are going to support one. And Xi Jinping is very clear about this. It's very much part of the ideology. And we report a speech that he gave to cadres where he explained that personal friendships are fine, but personal friendships should work for the party, that your friends should be friends for the party. It's quite a chilling way of understanding the natural human desire to make and cultivate friendships. And as Morika mentioned, when the CCP aims at elites, we think about political elites, which of course are exceptionally important, but also business elites, academic elites, intellectual elites more broadly, and think tanks and so on, but also media elites and cultural elites. And we give many, many examples throughout the book of how elites in various countries in the West have been won over and come to speak the language and the ideas that favour the interests and the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. In political elites, of course, it doesn't focus only on central governments, although that tends to attract most of the attention. Certainly here in Australia, I'm in Canberra, where I live, all of the newspaper attention has been on the federal government and the influence of CCP agents of influence, Chinese billionaires making donations, and so on the major political parties in government, but also in opposition. But what we've seen in recent times is a much heavier focus on influencing politicians at the state or provincial and the local or municipal government level. There's a very strong influence. And this is very apparent too in Canada. In fact, it's one of the most interesting phenomena of CCP influence in Canada, the way in which it has targeted provincial governments and municipal governments for its influence activities. And we explain in the book why this is an important influential tactic that the party uses. It's part of a broader strategy known as use the countryside to surround the cities. And so, for example, in this dispute that Australia is currently having with Beijing, when Beijing has imposed trade sanctions because Australia initiated the call for an impartial international inquiry into the origins and impacts of COVID-19. What we've seen is some loud megaphones being pulled out in the state capitals, in Perth, for example, and in Melbourne, and where state premiers and other senior politicians, plus powerful business people, have been pointing their megaphones at Canberra and saying, we must back down, we must not upset Beijing because it's not in our economic interests. This is a very prominent example of using the countryside to surround the cities. So in targeting elites, the CCP has some very well-developed and sophisticated strategies, and we discuss them in great detail. United Front principles are very much at the centre of these activities, and we talk about the United Front a great deal in the book, of course, and explain its function, its operations, the network of agencies and the way they are mirrored in Western countries, how those United Front agencies in Western countries exert their influence both within the diaspora and increasingly in recent years outside of it. And we also discussed some of the more detailed techniques that the party uses to extend its influence, all of which arise out of the deep history of the Communist Party from the 20s and through the 30s and 40s, which were proved effective and which Mao Zedong wrote about in detail in his writings, which are constantly developed and applied by the party. And the basic point we want to make is that they're often very subtle but very effective personal influencing techniques. I've started to use the word grooming, the grooming of politicians and business leaders and academic elites in a way that's very persuasive. And we see it, for example, at the University of Queensland, where there's a very, very globally important dispute going on, where the university is attempting to use all of its might and legal powers to crush the voice of a student, an undergraduate student, who's been pointing out the close links of the university to the CCP. And so we've seen the party use its grooming techniques on these elites so that they come to believe that when they say that we must not do anything to upset Beijing, that we're totally in favour of free speech, but this student has really gone too far, and so we're actually going to try to expel him from the university. Really, we're seeing very powerful people who've been gradually over the years, through their contact with senior cadres, won over to a point of view where they believe that the interests of their institution cannot be unaligned with those of Beijing. If they upset Beijing, that's not in the interests of their institution or indeed their nation if they're in the federal government. So we go into a great deal of detail about how this works, and we've a lot of examples, some of which are very worrying indeed. So I hope that's sufficiently tantalising for people to want to buy the book and read the details. We can, of course, now give a lot more detail in this session if people would like to ask us questions.
Okay.
Thank you, Clive. Sorry, go ahead, Charles. I think it's good if you could comment, but also if there are questions you would like to ask our great two authors, that would be good. Already some of the questions are getting in through Slido. So if some of our viewers want to ask them, please go to YouTube to our link where you are probably watching this. And below the clip, you see a link to Slido where you can ask your questions. But sorry, Charles, now it's your turn.
Thank you very much. Well, I have read the book, and I've written a foreword for the Canadian edition, and I agree with Clive. Everyone should be reading this book. It's very timely, I think, as the global discourse on China is shifting, and so it does. I think it should add momentum to the cause that we have been, involved in for all these years with Clive's earlier book, Silent Invasion, which is concern about the co-opting of elites in Western democracies by agents of the Chinese regime. A few days ago, I was in touch with Clive by message, and He said, so much is happening in Canada, it's hard to keep up. And I agree with him, particularly after the COVID-19. In fact, in April of last year, Clive did an interview with the Canadian National Post, and he suggested that China's soft power influence is more pronounced in Canada than in Australia and New Zealand. But there have been changes in Canada, which I think parallel changes in other parts of the world with regard to China. And in Canada, the main thing was that we had an election last October, and Justin Trudeau's government was reduced to minority status in the Canadian Parliament. So they remained in power, but they could be overruled in votes in Parliament. And so shortly after that, the opposition parties united, and against the ruling Liberal Party's wishes, established a special committee on Canada-China relations in the Canadian House of Commons. And this met a few times before the COVID-19 crisis. And, you know, I was the first non-government witness at that committee. And my views, which I expressed about, you know, the usual matters like Huawei and Uyghurs and Tibetans and Magnitsky and Chinese state investment in Canada and Chinese state influence and harassment operations in Canada and so on, at that time was still sort of a voice in the wilderness. You know, my testimony was different from most of the others. I think that has now changed in Canada, and the mainstream discourse is coming round very much to high awareness and sensitivity, and taking much more seriously the issues that Marika and Clive highlight in their book, both regard to Canada, which there's quite a lot of content, and parallel issues elsewhere. But, you know, it's still an ongoing issue. Our Canadian foreign minister hired an advisor on China who had previously advised Stéphane Dion, the previous foreign minister, to pedal softly on human rights issues. And just last month, our Minister of Health, Patty Haiju, vigorously defended the credibility of the PRC's actions and reporting of COVID-19, insisting, this is a quote, "There's no indication the data that came out of China in terms of their infection rates and their death rate was falsified in any way." When a reporter followed up with a question about this is just last month, she said, "Your question is feeding into conspiracy theories that many people have been perpetuating on the internet." So even though there's a shift in public opinion, you know, the Liberal government is still lagging behind the curve on these sorts of issues. But on May the 13th, a Canadian polling company, the Angus Reid, issued a poll that said only 14% of adults in this country now say they have a positive opinion of China. So that's, you know, suggesting 86% don't. More than 4 in 5, 85%, say that the Chinese government has not been honest about what happened in China with regard to the novel coronavirus. And if Canadians had their way, there would be real-world consequences to the perceived malfeasance on the part of China. Just 11% of Canadians say Canada should focus its trade efforts on China, down from 40% in 2015. So we're seeing a much more emphasis on concerns over Chinese cyber espionage, interference with people in Canada, both Chinese citizens and Canadians, both of whom are protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And 4 in 5 in the poll said that Canada should bar Huawei from taking part in building the new 5G infrastructure in Canada. So while the government refuses to make a decision on Huawei, clearly if they do make the decision, 80% of Canadians will not be supportive of it. And asked about China's support to relations, Canada's support to relations in China, 76% say Canada should prioritize human rights and the rule of law over economic opportunity. So we have here a strong split between, most Canadians and the Canadian corporate elite who have such an important influence over the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa. And indeed, the security agencies are inclined to support the idea that our China policy, based on prioritizing the promotion of Canadian prosperity through trade, is a wrong-headed policy for the many, many reasons that are detailed in Marika and Clive's book. I think the other aspect is that the letter that European Values, the Macdonald Laurier Institute, and the Henry Jackson Society promoted, called "The Chinese Party's Rule by Fear Endangers Chinese Citizens and the World," in addition to being endorsed by, all four of us, was also taken up by Canadian politicians, including the former Liberal Minister of Justice, Irwin Cotler, who is a very distinguished human rights lawyer with a strong international reputation, and the current leader of the opposition Conservatives, and both of the leading candidates to succeed him as leader of the Conservatives, and many other politicians. So there does seem to be a lot of momentum in the political class to at least express concern about the activities of the Chinese regime in Canada. This then led to quite a lurid criticism of the Macdonald Laurier Institute by the Chinese embassy in Ottawa, which received a milquetoast response from the Canadian Foreign Ministry that did not mention the Macdonald Laurier Institute at all. So I think the other things that we're looking at, and I think it was alluded to a bit by Marika, is that, Russian-style misinformation, this, Jolly Jen, the Chinese foreign minister's suggestion that the coronavirus originated in a laboratory in the United States and was brought to China by U.S. military participating in the World Military Games in Wuhan in the fall, just a ridiculous idea to sort of confuse the narrative so that the true narrative is depicted as one possibility of many. I think Jakob would be able to speak much more about this kind of Russian-style approach. Is not working. And the wolf warrior diplomacy being adopted by some Chinese ambassadors, particularly Lu Xiaoye, who was in Canada and is now in Paris, or Gui Zhongyou in Sweden, is also backfiring. The Chinese ambassador's suggestion that Canada and its Western allies are white supremacists for calling for the release of the two Canadians arbitrarily detained under harsh conditions in China, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, in retaliation for Canada's detention of the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou in response to a U.S. extradition request, did not go over well. Yesterday, his successor connected the arrest of Kovrig and Spavor and Canada's lack of any form of consular access to Kovrig and Spavor since January 15th. In other words, not only do the consular officials not get to go to prison, the two prisons where they're being held, but also no video contact, no telephone contact. We just don't know if they're healthy or not. He connected this to retaliation for the detainment of Meng Wanzhou. The ambassador Cong Pei-chun also denied any validity to the suggestion that there is a United Front Work Department intimidation and coercion program in Canada, as detailed in a report by the Canadian Coalition on Human Rights in China that I advised, which is coordinated by Amnesty International Canada, that came out on May 11th, entitled Harassment and Intimidation of Officials in Canada Working on China-Related Human Rights Concerns. So, in general, I think China's public diplomacy is failing, and that Canadians are starting to tune in to the kind of concerns that you raise in your very important book, and I expect a lot of sales. We even had our ambassador to Beijing, who previously spent years living in Shanghai working for McKinsey as an investment advisor, in a ostensibly private gathering of the Canadian International Council done this way over the web, but the private gathering involved over 400 attendants. So the idea that he was speaking privately might be a bit rich. But this ambassador, our ambassador in Beijing, said that China is alienating foreign countries, damaging its global soft power by accumulating negative soft power thanks to its defensive and incredible response to international criticism over COVID-19. And the Canadian government is now backing the review of the World Health Organization's response to the pandemic. So while our Prime Minister did not endorse that statement directly, and certainly it's an odd thing for an ambassador to announce a shift in policy. Ambassadors are supposed to implement policy, not make it. Mr. Trudeau did not, speak against what Ambassador Barton had said, and didn't fire Ambassador Barton as he did with our previous ambassador, John McCallum, who is detailed in the book. I think the section is entitled "The Strange Case of John McCallum," or something like that. Anyway, it was pretty golden. So that suggests that he doesn't feel Mr. Barton has spoken out of turn, which would suggest that this could be a Canadian policy in the future. So we have senior Liberal officials or retired Liberal officials, both leading candidates to Conservative leadership. Dominic Barton, more or less, many other politicians, most of the punditocracy, people speaking on radio and TV and writing editorials in newspapers, coming round to the kinds of discourse that you are really pushing forward in the book. So I'm coming out of this feeling optimistic, although, I'll believe it when I actually see the legislative measures and actions taken against the Chinese regime. But I do congratulate you on really putting together such a convincing discourse on this matter. And I really encourage everybody to get the book and read it and insist that our governments follow the implied recommendations that the book makes.
Right. Thank you, Charles. We have a couple of questions already coming up. So let me say at least two of them and then do another round. So the first question actually comes from Yuan Grant, and he asks, what examples have you seen in Eastern and Western European organizations self-censorship regarding Chinese influence operations? So have any of you seen anybody self-censoring over talking of CCP influence in mainly Europe, but I guess we could really dig into any democracy where you have seen anything like that. That's the first question. And the second question I would pose is which countries or institutions would you say actually respond pretty well to the CCP interference? So if you could give a couple of good practice examples, because we quite often speak over how our liberal democratic institutions are failing. So I think it's good to say if there is some light, if there is somebody doing it quite well, if some of you think about it. Right, who wants to start?
Marika, do you want to?
Marika first, then Charles, then Clive, then, if I can. Please, Marika.
Sure, I can go ahead. So in terms of self-censorship, I think there are definitely plenty of examples on the corporate side of individual employees saying something that the CCP does not like. The NBA in the United States was an example. Here in Germany, we had a German soccer player standing up for Uyghurs who are imprisoned in China, and of course, his soccer club immediately distanced himself from him. There have been cultural performances that have been canceled at theaters in Europe. There has been at film festivals, films have been canceled. And one of the things that I find more concerning, I guess, is that oftentimes we now see the excuse, or I mean, I can only posit it's an excuse, but my assumption would be it very well may be that, oh, this is technical difficulties to blame, which if you've been following how this is done in China. It's extremely disconcerting to see that same language actually pop up over here as well. So you can really see it spreading. You can see individual institutions being attempts to discredit them, as happened to ASPI in Australia. You can see attempts over here as well to do that to some of the more critical think tanks, of which I guess there are not that many, but they do exist. And there are attempts, often behind the scenes, sometimes publicly, of discrediting them, saying, if you want to be credible, you government or you business association, maybe you don't want to associate yourself with them. You see at public talks, you can see disclaimers or supposed agreements that you can only talk about apolitical stuff. You're not supposed to raise any politics. That's increasingly something that's coming up. So this is really not something that is that rare anymore. It's almost, at this point, to me, it's rare when someone says no and decides to go public with it. So that would be my response to that part. Maybe on the positive example. So it's very hard. It's very hard to pick positive examples because I think, at least in Europe, almost every country fails in its own way. What I usually say is the good examples are not to be found in Europe's large countries. In fact, that is like Germany, UK, France. That's actually where elite entanglement, to some extent, has the most progressed. Some of the best responses I have received so far to my talks, in the sense that people were taking this very seriously, was actually in the Baltic states. So when I spoke there, I got the sense that Chinese CCP influence is being taken seriously because people see a parallel to what Russia is doing on that territory. So there's an immediate understanding of what the problem is, and I don't have to start to explain what the issue is. People understand. So I think there's actually quite a bit to learn from the Baltic state, and by extension, I think Western Europe would do well to look towards, I don't want to say Central and Eastern Europe in general, because there are some pretty bad cases as well, but some of the approaches there, I feel like there's more awareness, again, left over from the Cold War, so that at least some people understand quite well what's going on. So that would be my response.
Thank you, Marike. I think, Charles, you are next, please.
There we go. I think that, certainly from the reality of the COVID-19 and China's willingness to use any kind of political or economic retaliation, that countries like Canada, who are still importing personal protective equipment, masks and gowns and respirators, sourcing from China, are reluctant to say anything that will get the Chinese government too upset, or at least their leaders won't say that. And our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has been giving almost daily briefings on Canada's response to the COVID-19 crisis. And initially, he wouldn't even say the word China in response to journalist questions. And more recently, he has. But he's also made it clear that he's not prepared to alienate his association with the Chinese authorities out of fear of immediately the personal protective equipment. And then, like many other countries, such as Sweden and Japan, Canada does have 2 citizens, including 1 diplomat on leave, who are currently being detained without charge and any kind of justification under very harsh conditions in China. And there is a perception, I think the perception is wrong, that if we continue to play nice with the Chinese communists, that they will decide to release them, even though they've now held these 2 gentlemen for over 570 days. And in general, concerns about trade pressures, China has imposed non-tariff barriers, arbitrarily blocking the imported China of $3 billion a year in canola seeds, an important Canadian export to China. You know, we do a lot of agricultural commodities. At one stage, China blocked all meat from Canada, also on false grounds, until China had a pork shortage due to the African swine flu and changed their mind on it. But I think there is concern about economic retaliation. And there are, you know, very significant elements, significant and influential elements in Canada who believe that we can ride through the storm, get Kovrick's favor released, either send Meng Wanzhou back to Beijing or send her to the United States where she's no longer our problem, and everything can go back to the way it was. Well, I think this is a declining perception, because I don't think that our idea that we should collaborate with Chinese regime goals in Canada in exchange for enhanced access to the Chinese market for Canadian commodities and services is working anymore. For one thing, you know, we haven't got a big market in China. Our exports to the United States account for 78%. China's was 4.7%. And after the Chinese non-tariff barriers were applied to block our trade on unjustified grounds, we're down to about 4%. So it's not that significant. The other factor is, you know, successful use by the United Front Work Department to suggest that any criticism of the People's Republic of China is a form of racism against persons of Chinese origin in Canada, which, you know, are a significant number, perhaps close to 5%, depending on how you decide who is Chinese and who isn't. Many of these, of course, are citizens of Canada. And so there's a political fear, and I think a misperception that if politicians speak against China, that they will lose at the polls in constituencies where there is a significant Chinese ethnic population. And I think in Clive and Marika's book, they also make reference to this. In terms of the positive element, I think it's the press. And, you know, if you look at my own situation, the Globe and Mail newspaper, a major Canadian newspaper, its publisher, editor, one of its reporters who'd done a series of articles about Michael Chan, who is spoken of in your book, also sued me because I published a piece on this Michael Chan situation entitled "The Murky World of Chinese Influence." So this is a kind of lawfare. But it seems that the threat of lawfare so far has had no impact on the publication, you know, the China stance of all major Canadian newspapers, the Toronto Star, National Post, and the Globe and Mail. And since they published my Murky World of Chinese Influence, I've published dozens of other op-eds. I do them quite regularly, nearly all of them on China, nearly all of them largely critical of Chinese government behavior in Canada. And the Globe still takes them and still publishes them. So I think that is a glimmer of hope that our public media continues to be willing to speak the truth about China, despite you know, intimidation and threat from the Chinese authorities. Of course, the Chinese language media, as you point out in your book, is quite a different story. So I see. I still feel optimistic about how things are developing. And feel that once the COVID-19 crisis is over, we will see a much improved reset in terms of how the West engages with China. And I do think that the book will make a very significant contribution to opinion on this topic.
Charles, I have a technical follow-up question from Paul Vella. He asks, when will the book be available in Canada? So.
I think it's early July, the last I heard.
Early July, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's available already for pre-order through online sources, and you can get the hardback, paperback, or electronic edition, so you can order it now. And I would urge people to get their order in early. Why not? Exactly.
Let's go to Clive, please.
Yeah, if I could just clarify that the Canadian edition is out on the 3rd of July. The Australian edition is published on the 16th of June. And the UK-US edition will be out sometime after that. It's still being decided upon. Too late, in my view, but there you go. Just on Ewan Graham's question, which is a good one about examples of self-censorship in Europe, as we know, it's actually very difficult to identify self-censorship because those who are censoring themselves really have to fess up to doing it. And very few people are willing to say, yeah, look, I caved into pressure from an authoritarian power. I'm morally weak. I'm sorry. But occasionally this does emerge. And I think it's actually one of the great unspoken problems on university campuses across the Western world, the extent to which academics do self-censor on the question of China for a range of reasons. In our book, we spend quite a bit of time focusing on think tanks because, again, as we argued, the CCP puts an enormous emphasis on the battle of ideas. For them, and I think quite rightly, the struggle over who prevails in the ideological sphere is exceptionally important. And so they don't, while there's a lot of focus on universities, they don't neglect think tanks. And in fact, think tanks have become a kind of primary target of the CCP in the last 5 to 10 years. And so we try to analyse the extent of CCP influence in a range of think tanks in Europe. And I think it's probably true to say that most of those who do work on China are pretty soft on the CCP. And so we tried to trace some of the links between those think tanks to money from China, their links with Chinese think tanks and other party organisations which may be disguised as non-party organisations. So it's worth having a look at that part of the book when it's available. As to a kind of cases where you can see signs of resistance to CCP influence, I'm particularly fascinated in Sweden at the moment, because it seems to me there's been an absolute sea change in attitudes in Sweden in recent times. And it really has started to say, no, enough is enough. We're not going to take this bullying anymore. So I'm watching, I think it's got some way to go, but I think I'm watching Sweden quite closely. I'm very pleased, incidentally, for any Swedish viewers that a Swedish edition of the book will come out later this year, and an Italian one as well. Another really interesting example in Europe is Prague City Council, and some of the people watching will be aware of the extraordinary events in Prague where a sister city agreement with Beijing came up for renewal, and the new mayor of Prague, who was the leader of the Pirate Party, which is not, for those who don't know, a joke, but actually a serious progressive party, he said, well, look, we want to cross out the clause which commits the Prague government to the one China policy. That's a matter of international relations. It's nothing to do with the sister city relationship. And Beijing and its representatives went berserk over this and tried to bully Prague by, for example, banning all cultural institutions with the name Prague in their name from their tours in China, and other kind of spiteful acts which are so common that we've seen from the CCP. But Prague stood its ground and said, no, this is a matter of principle for us. If we're going to be forced to endorse the one China policy, which we said is not relevant to a sister city agreement, then we'll end it. And end it they did, and instead they signed, this is the lovely twist at the end, they signed a sister city agreement with Taipei. And I find this, the way in which the Chinese Communist Party kind of weaponizes, if I can use that now overused term, sister city agreements, one of the most fascinating aspects of influence operations. And we devote quite a bit of space into exploring sister city agreements, because in the West, well-meaning groups in cities all across the United States and Canada and Australia and Germany agree after approaches to engage to sign a sister city agreement with a city in China, without realizing that this is not a negotiation, an agreement amongst communities in cities, but in fact there's a community in the United States or Germany or wherever actually signing an agreement which has been originated, organised, encouraged and approved by an agency of the Chinese Communist Party, the CPAFFC, the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries. It's a United Front agency, and its job is to organise and manage sister city relationships in a way that advances the interests of the Communist Party in local governments and municipalities throughout the West. So it's a form of a very covert, subtle influence, which has actually been mobilised, we've noticed, in the trade dispute in the United States. So that's something that I think is, building on the Prague example, very, very important to watch. And one of the consequences I hope will come out of our book is that many people in cities in the West will say, well, let's look at our sister city relationship. We want to have a great friendly relationship with the citizens of Tianjin or Wuhan or Shanghai. Terrific, all in favour of that. But if we are being manipulated by a secret organisation of the Chinese Communist Party so they can use us as a way of gaining political influence in our country, then we don't want anything to do with it. That's what the mayor of Prague said.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you, Clive. I can only confirm that this actually did happen and is still happening in Prague. And some of the cities in Sweden are actually seizing their own sister city agreements as well, seeing that there are ways they could do something about it, and that Prague was not destroyed because of what happened, essentially. I would give the floor briefly to Marike, because I understand she needs to leave us in a couple of minutes as well. But Marike, actually, there's a question which I believe is directly for you. It's posed anonymous, but I think it's a fair question. Have you spoken to governments in Europe? To what extent are they aware of the Chinese infiltration? What do those European governments say, actually, when you talk to them about it?
So, yes, I have not quite frequently, but more and more frequently, actually. My sense is that across Europe, at least across large parts of Europe, in parts of the national government, like foreign affairs, there is an increasing awareness of the problematic nature of the relationship that various European countries have built with China, about the way that the CCP is now using that to exert pressure. So the problem is not that nobody understands anything. I feel like I've spoken to a lot of people that actually make me quite hopeful that they are on top of what is happening. But the problem is this is usually just one part of national governments. And there are obviously many other ministries that have different interests, that have an interest in maintaining good relationships, that have an interest in making sure that whatever is happening behind the scenes or not happening behind the scenes does not interfere with economic relations with China. So this is not something that, despite increasing awareness, I feel like it hasn't gone mainstream enough, quote unquote. The other problem that we do have and that we do raise in the book briefly is that even if national governments are perfectly aware of what's happening, a lot of the national security concerns that exist at the national level don't exist at the local level, because that's simply not people's concern. I mean, at a local government level, the primary concern is, what can I do for local politics? What can I do for local business? And that whole national security and influence perspective is simply missing. So in order to get further on this, more people than just, I guess, the foreign affairs crowd and the intelligence crowd need to get on board in national government. And then there also needs to be a conversation on how to get local governments on board. I mean, what happened in Prague is exemplary, but I think it's still very much an exception. among a handful of other examples. So this is the basic problem that we're facing.
Right. Thank you, Marike. Very good. And I have a next question, which comes from John Deney, from U.S. Army War College. Do authors see any daylight between CCP influence activities and the exploitative activities of China-based multinationals? Which I think is a very good question. So who wants to answer it? Clive, I see you are heading up, right? Go ahead.
Well, we talk quite a lot about the party corporate conglomerate in China, and one of the great mistakes, or it's not a mistake, it's kind of lack of awareness in the West, is that we see people in the West, analysts, business people, politicians, assume that the basic relationship between the business community and government is kind of similar to the way it operates in the West, and it isn't, and it's becoming less so. Even though, of course, there's been a massive growth of private enterprises in China, and of course state enterprises as well. The Communist Party controls, or can control, private companies at any time wherever they are. It doesn't mean they always control them, but they can if it's in their strategic or economic or other interests to do so. And so one of the arguments we hear in Australia as elsewhere, and it's a kind of politically correct argument that we often hear, including from CCP supporters here, is that when considering the issue of foreign investment in Australia, we should not treat Chinese investment in any way differently to the way we treat investment from Japan or the United States or Britain. And I say to that, well, I simply don't agree with that. And that's because the nature of the relationship between investors in China, whether they be corporate or individual, whether they be state-owned or private, their relationship to the state, which effectively means the Chinese Communist Party, is really quite different. And so investors might buy up infrastructure in Australia or agricultural land or urban blocks or manufacturing industry purely with commercial motives in mind, in the way other investors do. But if the Chinese Communist Party decides it wants to mobilize that firm or individuals in it for United Front influence purposes, for intelligence purposes, for pursuing CCP strategic objectives, then it will do it. And there's nothing those people can do about it. And particularly so with the law of 2017, which requires all Chinese companies and individuals operating abroad to comply if they are asked by China's intelligence agencies to do something on their behalf. They must comply. And you really don't want to cross the intelligence agencies of China. And so that means that investors from China are different. I mean, it's unfortunate for them. Most of them would rather just make money, but the truth is that some of them are going to be operating on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. And there's the point we make in the book, which is one that Anne-Marie Brady keeps stressing quite rightly, and that is that United Front work is not carried, that is influence work abroad, in this case, is not carried out only by the United Front Work Department and its plethora of agencies, which you'll see in the book. There's I think, an extremely helpful chart, if people can see that, just to give you an idea of the structure of United Front agencies from China and how they spread into Western countries. But as Anne-Marie Brady says, and we echo this in the book, United Front work is the responsibility of every member of the Chinese Communist Party wherever they are. So they're doing it all the time. That's part of their duty. It's like the notion of friendship. If you have friends, they should be friends for the party. And that's why the party corporate conglomerate is really a fundamental way of thinking about Chinese business activity wherever it exists in the world. You need to understand that relationship where corporations fit in the party corporate conglomerate, what their obligations are, in order to understand the kinds of activities they carry out beyond their normal commercial ones.
Thank you very much, Clive. Actually, Charles, there is a question which I think you could answer quite well. What do you think is a good strategy for small countries to deal with Chinese bullying, like state-sponsored consumer strike? So essentially a trade boycott, which we have seen the PRC, the Chinese government, actually doing against various countries.
Well, I think this is an ongoing concern. And, you know, the bottom line is that we really have to be seeking alternative trade partners. For a country like Canada, whose external trade to China is primarily agricultural commodities, of course, it's a global market. So if China bars the Canadian product, then you know, they'll have to source from somewhere else, which will then open up a market for Canada to fill. So there's only a limited supply of, say, you know, canola seeds or meat and so on. So I think from that point of view, you know, because of the impact of China's agenda to destroy the international rules-based order, you know, to try and bring the WTO and the UN institutions into irrelevance and replace them by the Xi Jinping's program of the common destiny of mankind, buttressed by the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, that we have to decide whether we can accept the terms under which China will open its markets to us. So I think that there's an increasing consensus that Canada and other countries should simply not accept the coercion and intimidation of the Chinese regime, using economic leverage to further their political infiltration into our countries. And so I think from that point of view, you know, we have to make it clear to the government of China that if they will not abide by the accepted norms of international trade and diplomacy, that we cannot engage with them until such time as they're prepared to do so. So I do think that, you know, the global community does have influence within China, and you know, that people inside China don't want to be a pariah state, that they are much more aware of the nature of their regime than we give them credit for, and that Xi Jinping's hold on power is much more fragile than we might think. I mean, certainly within Canada, you know, there is increasing pressure by the Chinese state to acquire key Canadian resources in mining and energy. And in 2013, the Chinese state, the Chinese National Overseas Oil Corporation, acquired for $15 billion a Canadian oil concern, Nexen. But the Conservative government at the time said that they would approve this acquisition, but would not allow in future Chinese state acquisition of over 50% of control of Canadian natural resources. And of course, this is not reciprocal, because you know, our countries cannot acquire natural resources inside China under the Chinese constitution. That's considered a national security matter. 2 years ago, quite to my surprise, after quite a lot of lobbying by the MLI and myself in writing things, the Canadian government decided not to allow the acquisition of Canada's largest privately traded construction company, Aecon, by a Chinese state firm. So, you know, that was an encouraging development. Now we have a situation of the COVID-19, and the government has announced restrictions on foreign acquisition of distressed Canadian companies. So right now there's a move by Shandong Gold Mining to acquire TMAC Resources, a troubled gold mining enterprise in Canada's north, for $207 million. That's a small amount, relatively speaking, for these acquisitions. But the question is, with the Western economy suffering from the impact of the economic turndown due to the coronavirus, a lot of companies are in trouble, and therefore a stronger state like China might want to come in and take advantage of this to take these acquisitions. And I would say, in terms of the strategy, the Chinese government seems to be very aware of the thresholds for investment review. So the 207 million would fall below the threshold. So if the Chinese state, makes many, many, many small acquisitions, then they will gain more economic leverage over the economies of smaller countries. And this will then allow them to exert political influence because of enhanced economic influence. I just to return to one of the questions, I would say, just with regard to the countryside surrounding the city, one major aspect of China's soft power has been panda diplomacy. And there are a couple of pandas in Canada that have been moving from the Toronto Zoo to the Calgary Zoo. Those are being sent back to China, not really for political reasons, but because we are unable to obtain the kind of bamboo that pandas eat. So we're having to repatriate them back to their native forests in Sichuan. But it does seem rather symbolic that as the relationship is turning down, the fuzzy creatures will be leaving Canada and returning to China. The other one, the larger question of, are political leaders in foreign countries aware of the degree to which the Chinese government has co-opted policymakers and politicians? And I think that they are certainly aware. This is sort of the activity that dares not speak its name. And as Clive has pointed out in his comments on Canada, within my country, there are senior political figures of all parties who in retirement are enjoying considerable benefits from Chinese-related enterprises, either board memberships or consultancies of different types. I think Anne-Marie Brady, in one of her pieces, I think it was her testimony to the New Zealand Parliament, suggested that, even academics who continue to express views expressive of Chinese interests in foreign countries can be deriving $150,000 US a year in different sorts of financial benefits from their affiliations with Chinese advisory institutions. So the problem really is that there's so many senior members of the Canadian political elite who are either enjoying benefits from China-related funding sources, or I think hoping for those benefits if they keep their noses clean while in policy-making positions and don't say anything critical of the Chinese regime, that in retirement they will be able to continue to do important work and not simply have to sit at home and cut their grass and read books. They can do things that involve travel to China and exciting membership in think tanks. So I think that there is awareness of this, but a severe reluctance to open up the window on it. Certainly last fall, a senator in the Canadian Senate, Yuan Pao Wu, published on his website a strong critique of the Australian Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act, which Clive and Marika refer to in their book quite extensively, which would require more transparency on foreign sources of income for policymakers and former policymakers. And so last fall, I think there was an attempt to suggest that this was poor legislation for Canada, that our security agencies are already fully in charge of this, that it would conflict with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right to privacy, and so on, by demanding that people expose their foreign income to public scrutiny. But I would suspect that once the COVID-19 crisis is over, that particularly with the Common Special Committee on Canada-China relations, that there will be great pressure to enact similar legislation to that of Australia. And I think Clive can comment on this more, but it has been quite effective in reducing Chinese influence over policymakers, because after all, sunshine is the best disinfectant.
Right, Clive, I have two questions for you. One, if you could please comment on the Austrian legislation, which I think is inspirational for many of other democracies. So that's first. And the second one would be, could you comment on the possible motivations for inactivity to address this issue? Do you see any others than greed and fear of losing market access coming from the corporate? So I guess parts of the business obviously would be against exposing PRC interference or upsetting the Chinese government's regime, let's say. So do you see any way out of it? Because obviously this is a major problem for many of Europeans. That's one of the main reasons why Europe is very weak on responding to Chinese interference right now.
Yes, indeed. Yes, thank you for that. It's really one of the core questions, isn't it? Fear and greed. One of the things I've been quite astonished about since I began working in this area, and Charles just kind of referred to it in the Canadian situation, is just how easy it is to buy some people off. Money is, it's kind of a cliche, the power of money, but it really is astonishing what people will do. Ex-politicians, for example, or ex-diplomats or academics, just how cheap it is to buy, their views. It's a regrettable thing to say, but I'm afraid it's true. So I think overcoming that is really making for those elites who are in the position where they are bought off, I think the most powerful response to it is public anger and public ridicule, so that it becomes embarrassing, shameful for those people once exposed to be speaking for an authoritarian foreign power. But in addition to fear and greed, I think there's a third factor which I've mentioned, and it's kind of easy to forget, but in a way it's the most powerful and most difficult one, and that is this process that I've mentioned of grooming, or winning over elites, individuals, to your way of thinking. And the CCP is extremely good at it. We look at their brazen propaganda and think, well, no one would believe anything they say. But behind the scenes, for years, they will work on people, people who are typically unwitting, that they're dealing with CCP officials or intelligence agents or PLA officers, thinking they're just dealing with ordinary business people or bureaucrats. And they worked on using these psychological techniques in a way that basically reshapes their thinking in a way. The techniques that they use, for example, is to persuade them that they are really important, that they have a unique insight into China, that they have a particularly important role in explaining China to Canada or Australia or whatever, and this was the case with the previous Canadian ambassador to China, John McCallum, whom Trudeau had to fire because he in the end was so inept. But he'd come to believe that his job was not to represent the Canadian government's view in Beijing. He'd come to believe that his job was to explain Beijing and China's position to the Canadian government. So the CCP had him by the short and curlies, but he couldn't understand it, he couldn't see it, and it led to really quite a tragic downfall in a way. So this process of grooming is exceptionally important. Let me give another case. We have a billionaire in Australia, mining billionaire named Andrew Forrest, who's in Western Australia. He's become a billionaire because he sells iron ore to China, and they've been working on him for years. And he's a very vocal participant in the public debate, constantly telling Canberra that they should be nice to Beijing. They shouldn't issue a statement regretting the death of Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Prize-winning dissident writer. They shouldn't push an independent inquiry into COVID-19. They should do everything they can do to keep Beijing happy. Now, it's very easy to say, well, he just makes his money and that's why he's doing it. But I'm convinced that if he sold all of his shares and got out of all of his interests in China and wasn't making a dollar from China anymore, he would continue to argue in the same way because he's been captured. And so I think this process of grooming powerful individuals is exceptionally important to understand and very hard to overcome because people who are driven by fear or greed know what the truth is and then understand that they're operating in a certain way because they're afraid, and that can be legitimate fear, or they're greedy, they just want to make money. But if people have come to genuinely believe that their point of view is the right one in the interest of their own country, whereas in fact it's in the interest of China, then you can't change their minds. You can only marginalise them. So I'm sorry, that was a long answer, but it's an exceptionally important one. In a way, it's one of the most important themes of the book. Australian legislation, let me try and be very brief because it's complicated. There are two pieces of legislation that are often confused. One is the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme, which is a bit like the US Foreign Agents Registration Act, which requires people who are acting on behalf of a foreign nation or a foreign principal, so it might be a corporation linked to China, for the Chinese state, for example, they have to put their name on a register. So there's that. And that's important, but I don't see it as particularly effective. It's just what should happen. Perhaps it has forced certain senior politicians, senior ministers, and even I can think of one or two ex-prime ministers who now have to be much more careful about their China links because they really don't want to have to put their name on this foreign agents register. The other piece of legislation, which I think is far more important, and that is the Foreign Interference Scheme, our law. And what this Foreign Interference Law, which is a first in the world, which is super important, and it defines a new crime with very heavy penalties, up to 10 years in jail. And the crime is acting in a covert way on behalf of a foreign power in order to influence a government process or prevent someone carrying out a democratic right. So acting covertly on behalf of a foreign power to influence a government process or interfere in the exercise of the democratic right. And so essentially this targets very deliberately, and the Parliament or the draftspersons who wrote this law and done a lot of research, they were saying, what is United Front activity? Let's define it and let's make it a crime. Now, so that legislation was passed 2 years ago. So far, there have been no prosecutions. But last year, the government announced that it was allocating an extra $90 million to law enforcement agencies in order to ramp up their investigations and bring prosecutions against people engaging in foreign interference in Australia. And many of us are looking on in great anticipation for the first prosecutions, because what will be revealed in the courts, be a lot of intelligence information, will shed a great deal of light on how the CCP goes about its foreign interference and foreign influence activities.
Right. Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, which I would like to have the same way for both of you. So if you could, let's say, be the main policymaker now in your country, or let's say in in a random general, let's say, democratic country in the West, what should your country's relationship with China look like? So should it be, as we call it, complete decoupling? Or what are the, let's say, possible components of the policy which you really think are in a way ideal, so that every democratic country in the world should take those policy measures or policy principles, which Clive mentioned in Australia, for example, which everybody in the democratic world should adopt to protect itself from the PRC interference in our democratic systems? So that's the main question. If you could use it as your closing statement, I think it's a good thing to actually end up on. So I think, Charles, you could start if it's not mine.
Well, I do think that it's important that we shouldn't be treating the Chinese regime in a way different from other countries. And so, I do think that in the case of Canada, there are more diplomats from the People's Republic of China accredited in Canada than any other country, including the United States. And, it's reasonable to assume that a number of those are involved in coercive or harassing activities or activities which are incompatible with their diplomatic status on the sharp power elements, such as facilitating bribery and so on. We really have to allow our intelligence agencies to present cases to governments, and these activities should not be tolerated. In other words, they should be declared persona non grata. So I think from that point of view, it's time to tighten up, and that the many reports that I'm aware of that Canadian security agencies and the Department of National Defence have sent through to our Privy Council office, and which have been shelved by the Prime Minister's office because of concern over negatively impacting on Canada's economic relationship with China. These should be now adopted, and we should be making it clear to the Chinese regime that they have to play by the rules, and if they don't, that there will be consequences. So I think from that point of view, it's important. In terms of the economic relationship, clearly, if we're being subjected to unfair tariff barriers as a means of coercion over political affairs, that we simply cannot tolerate that, and that we should not be collaborating in that sort of activity and imposing reciprocal actions against the Chinese regime, despite the asymmetrical power relations that exist between smaller countries and China. We have to start putting our foot down and not being the outsider that hopes to derive benefits while the rest pay the cost. I would say, just as one final thing, I think it is important that that our proposals with regard to adopting a much more pragmatic and honest and transparent line with China should not be taken as expressing racism towards persons of Chinese origin in our countries, as the Chinese government is inclined to try and reframe it. And this, just yesterday in an interview with the Chinese ambassador to Canada, this matter was brought up. There is no relationship between persons, ethnic Chinese in Canada, and the Chinese Communist Party's management of the novel coronavirus. And certainly I feel very distressed when I see comments on pieces I've written in newspapers critical of Chinese government activities in Canada, which say, in effect, splendid piece by Burton, let's round up all the Chinese and ship them back to China as soon as possible. This really should not be a matter of ethnic or racial prejudice, but simply a matter that the Chinese Communist Party is not representative of the Chinese people, and that their activities should not be tolerated in liberal democracies, but that this, on the other hand, we should be fully protecting our persons of Chinese origin from either harassment from agents of the Chinese state or from racist incidents enacted by white idiots in our own countries.
Right. Thank you, Charles. Clive?
Yeah, I very much endorse Charles's last comment. I mean, look, all of us want a harmonious, mutually beneficial, long-term economic and cultural relationship with China and the Chinese people. The reason we don't have that is because of the Chinese Communist Party. And so whether we do have that kind of productive, harmonious relationship is really entirely up to the bosses of the Chinese Communist Party. As long as they continue to behave in a way that exploits the international rule system, engages in bullying of small nations, carries out influence and interference operations in other countries trying to influence their political decision-making, spreads fear in the Chinese diaspora around the world, intimidates its critics around the world. As long as it does all of those things, it's extremely difficult for people to have, for well-meaning people, to have a proper relationship with China. And so what's the way forward? As long as China is ruled by the Chinese Communist Party behaving the way that it does, well, I don't think it's possible to decouple completely. There's no question that many industries in many countries will protect themselves from excessive reliance on the Chinese market. It's just good business practice. And I think what we need to see governments doing is to say to businesses that are exposed to becoming the targets of political blackmail is that you've gone into this, or you should have gone into this Chinese market with your eyes open, and you know what the risks are. If you become the subject of a political blackmail target, as we've seen in Australia with the barley industry and the beef industry and others that may follow, then that's part of your business risk. Do not ask the taxpayers to bail you out, and do not ask Australians in this case to sacrifice their democratic principles in order to cover up your poor business practices. So we will, of course, continue to have trade relations, strong ones in the case of Australia, but I think it will start to change quite a lot. I think in the high-tech field, we are seeing and will see the world split into two technological hemispheres, if you like. One governed by US European rules, regulations and standards, a much more open technological system, and one run by China, which will be subject to China's standards, which is trying to bring into all kinds of international institutions, and also China's repressive system of information control. And sadly, there are some countries around the world that are attracted, some regimes around the world that are attracted to that. So, but I think just to finish right at the very end, I just want to come back to the question somebody asked about how small countries can stand up to bullying by Beijing. I think the first answer is that you do need to stand up. In other words, I think nations need to be willing to take the pain as the economic consequences are imposed on them for doing something that displeases Beijing. It needs to take the form of calm resistance and unwillingness to give in to bullying. That depends a great deal on the level of awareness within the population. In Australia, we've seen the federal government in recent weeks respond quite in an excellent way to the economic blackmail that Beijing has threatened to carry out and is now carrying out. The government has said calmly and consistently, we will not give in to this kind of pressure. We simply won't. And because the Australian people are so angry for these attempts to bully us, no government could give in to this kind of intimidation and continue in office, because they would be seen to have sold out their country and have become lackeys. So that simply won't happen. So standing up and holding firm but without engaging in hysterics, but doing it calmly and clearly and stating your position is essential. The other one, I'll finish on this point, is alliances. We must not allow the CCP to carry through on its tactic known as kill the chickens to scare the monkeys. That is to pick out one country, often a weak link, and kill the chicken, that is to strangle it, to get it to submit, to succumb, and to scare all other countries. It also happens in the business sphere. So they decide, well, I'm not going to get in that position. I won't do anything to upset Beijing. And so I think having solidarity amongst nations, making sure that people are not picked off one by one is really essential to pushing back against this campaign of intimidation. So, but let's hope that at some point in the not too distant future that some of the people within the Chinese Communist Party will see that this extremely aggressive approach to the rest of the world, manifested most recently in wolf warrior diplomacy, is only going to cause pain for China and the people of China, and decides to become a responsible international citizen when it can be welcomed into a global community as a responsible superpower. That's my hope.
All right. Thank you very much, Clive and Charles. And thank you for being with us. I know it has been pretty early in the morning in Canada and quite late in Australia. So I'm really sorry for this time difference, but we cannot change geography really. So thank you again for doing it with us. And to all of those who watched us, you will also find the recording of this broadcast on our YouTube channel, and it will be all spread all over the news and everywhere. So thanks again. Good morning and good night as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye, Clive. Bye, Jakob. Nice to be with you today.
Bye.